буде пані Островська-Люта, так? Я правильно? І дуже цікава річ. От вчора я мав таку дуже милу розмову з паном Еш, який викладає в Оксфорді, і він мені говорив, що в нього за життя було всього-навсього декілька найкращих студентів. Снайдер і Енн Епплбом. Оплески. Ми ще не встигли цю залу переробити, бо минулого тижня ми тут приймали дуже багато поважних гостей, 35 міністрів. І я думаю, що сьогодні ви будете мати можливість задавати гострі запитання, тому що, напевно, то, що публічно можна написати, це одна річ, а то, що можна говорити з мудрими людьми, напевно, можна бути трошки відкритими. Ще раз великі оплески для гостей і дякую вам, що ви прийшли. Дякую. Бажаю вам доброго модерування.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to see so many of you today, especially on Saturday. Yenn Epplbom, welcome to Lviv.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, like it's always a pleasure to be in Lviv. So this is not my first trip. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. Yenn Epplbom is one of the most interesting commentators of international affairs, world politics, in the world, actually. And she's also an author to whom Ukrainian society is hugely indebted for your book, The Red Famine. I read it a few years ago, and I'm still impressed. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you. No, the Red Famine is a history of the Ukrainian Holodomor. It's not the first one in English, but it was the first one kind of full history to use archives.
And also so interestingly written, probably the first one. So today we will speak both about international and global affairs and a little bit about more abstract issues. And my first question would be about the state of American democracy and America in the world. What is happening? We would be very interested to hear your account. What is happening in the US now, and what is happening globally, therefore, because of what happens in the US right now?
So thank you. Those are two slightly different questions, although they are related. I think what's happening in the US should be familiar to Ukrainians because it happened here under Viktor Yanukovych. So we have a president who is seeking to claim more power for the presidency at the expense of our other branches of government. So at the expense of Congress and the courts and other institutions of the state. It's not absolutely the first time it's happened in American history, although this is a particularly, some of the tactics and methods he's using are unusual. We are remember that Trump was president before, then he lost an election, but he never admitted to losing it, and as you will remember in January of 2021, he staged an attempt to overturn the election, both in Washington but also around the country, seeking to persuade people to change their electoral college votes. What's therefore happened in the last 4 years is that he has attracted to him a lot of other radical people who also want the US system changed. And so the difference between Trump now and Trump in the first term is the people who are around him. And they're people who also want very radical changes made to the US political system and who are willing to help him do that. The other big change is that in the US system, we have the executive and Congress and the courts, and they compete with one another. And right now, the role of Congress is very weak. So Congress is led by Republicans who don't want to challenge the president. So for example, in the US system, only Congress can decide about taxation, and only Congress can decide about tariffs. But Congress has ceded to the president this right to make decisions about tariffs, and I don't have to repeat to you what the result is. Trump has also sought to change many institutions to cut programs throughout the U.S. system in ways that should not be his right. These are congressionally mandated programs, but he's, almost as a challenge to Congress and as a challenge to the courts, he's making these changes. So this is in that sense, it's a challenge to the U.S. political system. The other challenge is the use of the presidency, and this again, you have seen this in this part of the world before, is the use of the presidency by Trump, but particularly by his family and people around him to make money. And this, again, is not normal in America. We haven't had this, at least not this scale of an open use of political power in order to create economic power. And that's, there are many, many examples of this, starting from Trump's creation of a cryptocurrency company that seems to attract investors who are interested in influencing the president, to the role of Elon Musk, who is in charge of regulating and running regulatory agencies that regulate his companies, but also subsidize his companies. And so there are many, many conflicts of interest built into the system, and many ways in which the presidency is being used for the first time as a way of earning money. I mean, many American presidents become rich after they leave office, and there's a long history of members of the presidential family trying to somehow benefit from their relatives, but this is on a completely different scale, and it is a real change, and it's, I think, actually so monumental and such a rapid change that I don't think the Americans voters have absorbed it yet or understood it. So we may eventually get there. I mean, many of you may have read about the gift of an airplane that the Qatari government gave to Trump last week, and that seemed to have resonated for the first time. People understood that that's wrong. It's, maybe because it's so vulgar and the planes, and it's, it's a $400 million present being given to the United States president from a country that has interest in influencing the president, and that's a very clear influence. It's easier to understand than cryptocurrency. So those are really big changes in the U.S., and I think partly because of them, the U.S. is mostly going to be focused on internally for the next few years. I mean, you won't see very creative things happening abroad because so much is going to be focused on home. And and I should say that the backlash to these changes is just beginning, and it's beginning to take shape. But many of the changes happen very fast. I mean, secondly, you're seeing, and this is hard to explain, but I mean, you are seeing an American withdrawal from the world, particularly the American decision to cut USAID money and other kinds of aid money. These were tools of American soft power. They weren't only about achieving influence. They were also about seeking to build democracy, seeking to build good relationships. The very, very abrupt and chaotic way in which they were brought to an end in the last few months. I actually heard last night from a Ukrainian friend who was affected by this a little bit, was very, very shocking, very unusual, and very dramatic. And it was a dramatic illustration of the way in which the U.S. is withdrawing now from some parts of the world. Earlier this year, I was in Africa, and you personally can see and feel what happens when it's not just the US, but the sort of liberal world withdraws from, I was in Sudan, and when you see that withdrawing from that conflict, you see there isn't really anything else to replace it except other powers who are interested in supplying weapons and competing militarily. So that will be a big change. Trump also has begun using this very aggressive language. I mean, you've heard it about Greenland, about Canada, about Panama. This is also a huge shift. We don't in American foreign policy in the last 100 years. You don't have American presidents talking about grabbing territory, especially from allies. To some extent, this is just Trump talking. And I don't see that there is a strategy to back up any of these changes. And to some extent, I mean, it reflects a shift in mindset away from a world where the United States is a leader of a global alliance of democracies and towards a much more transactional world where every country does what it can and makes what, you know, and you know, the strongest countries win. You know, remembering that the United States is a very big country, and there are very many other elements of foreign policy besides the president. There's Congress, there's companies, there's, you know, the military. There are all kinds of thousands, really, of agreements and arrangements that the U.S. have with the world, and Trump is not able to destroy all of them. So this is some, you know, he's very visible, and what he does seems very dramatic. But there are still some, you know, underlying links, for example, between the U.S. and Europe don't go away. So I don't want people to become too alarmed, but this certainly rhetorically and visually, it's a huge shift in U.S. foreign policy. So that's the beginning of the change. I mean, there's more to say, but that's the basic outline.
Well, there have been so many topics touched upon, so I don't know which question to ask next. But if you could tell us a little bit more about this one. As a Ukrainian, I remember all my life having two big examples about good countries. And the beacon of democracy and good governance and good life has been the US. And the good example, how things can be changed and how you can succeed, has been Poland. The first time Ukrainians were shocked that those good examples are disappearing was some 10 years ago in Poland, but now Poland seems to be back on the track of liberalism. What do you think would be the impact on the world of the current state of the US?
Well, first of all, Poland is an example of how these kinds of changes are not irreversible. I mean, again, Ukraine is also an example of how, you know, Ukraine under Yanukovych was also a state where the president was taking more and more power, where he was acting against the constitution, you know, where all kinds of civil liberties were being undermined, and where you had this rampant, extraordinary corruption. And I don't know that you've fixed everything, but there have been a lot of changes since then, and Ukraine went in a different direction. So, and Poland also went in a different direction after the election in 2023. So I don't want anyone to be too apocalyptic, you know, that this is somehow the end of democracy or the end of the United States or the end of everything. I mean, these kinds of movements come in cycles, and maybe the fact, you know, we've never had one quite exactly like this in the United States, although we have had very overbearing presidents before. But we haven't had one quite like this in recent times. You know, that doesn't mean it's going to be like this forever. So I would just say that. But I mean, it's true that the implications, if you just look at the relation between the U.S. and its allies, the implications are, I mean, hard. It's, you know, there's so many that they're hard to list. I mean, there are economic implications. You know, the U.S. and Europe, the U.S. and Canada were essentially one economy. You know, they were so interlinked in terms of energy and in terms of electricity and in terms, you know, not just trade, you know, but all kinds of things, and travel and so on. It was almost an open border. And how you put back a border and, you know, what that means for companies and people on both sides is very hard to, you know, there will be immediate hardship for a lot of small companies on the border. The implication for US and Europe is the same. I mean, they weren't, maybe not quite so close, but still very, very close economies, very deep trade links, very deep educational links. Again, scientists going back and forth, you know, joint ways of regulating, joint ways of making decisions. And how, you know, how the world functions without all those things is also hard to imagine. I mean, I can't see how, there's no scenario in which this is good for business, and there's no scenario in which it creates more cooperation or more peace. I mean, it just doesn't. But I should say you are also seeing the Trump administration begin to backtrack on some of the very radical things that Trump did and said in the first 2 months, especially on tariffs, as it becomes clear that there was really no strategy and there was no clear idea about how what kind of impact the tariffs would have. I also have to say, and this I find I can't really convince people of this, I don't believe that there's an overall American strategy towards Russia and Ukraine either. And that's both good and bad. I mean, I don't think Trump wants Putin to win. I know some people here believe that. But I also don't think he has an idea of how the war will end. I think he thought that, I mean, he says, it's very important to listen to him because he says what he thinks. Including when things that aren't true. But he believed that the war started because of Joe Biden, and he believed that once he became president, the war would be over, because Putin likes him and would stop the invasion because he's president now. And
Amazing.
He seems to be surprised that that's not true. He has he said it again in the last couple of days.
That's amazing.
But I think that's true. I mean, I don't think he's lying about that. I mean, this is what he believes. And I don't think there is an alternative strategy. So he thought that if he's nice to Russia and if he puts pressure on Ukraine, and he shows that America is friendly to Russia, then the war will end. And now that it hasn't, I don't think he has a different strategy. Of course, there are people around him who do have different strategies, and we'll see. But expecting, a lot of people want to interpret what he does. There's a secret game, and there's a conspiracy, and that, the game with Zelensky in the Oval Office was some kind of pretend play acting. I mean, I don't believe any of that. I think actually what you see, what he says, is what he believes. And he talks all the time. I mean, he said he was on television again yesterday, and I saw a social media comment saying, why is he always on television? But he's a little bit like, you have this with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, you've had it with other similar leaders. He likes to be on TV speaking all the time. He speaks every day. He's like an hour or 2 hours every day. He's somewhere. And he's saying all the time what he thinks. And this is what he says. He's not offering right now a future strategy. I mean, there is in the Senate, there is actually a Republican, bipartisan, in fact, bill that would increase sanctions on Russia, including oil and gas sanctions, and maybe that's a card that will be played. Maybe if Russia doesn't stop the war tomorrow, that will happen. But I can't promise. I don't know.
You have mentioned Hugo Chavez, and you have also written a recent book called Autocracy Incorporated, where you describe autocracies as, if I'm not mistaken, as a sort of global phenomenon, and also a network in a way. Can you please tell us about that a little bit? What is this Autocracy Inc.?
So Autocracy Inc. was a book that described a network of states who don't necessarily have the same ideology. So communist China and nationalist Russia and North Korea and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela and theocratic Iran. These are actually very different states. They have very different systems and different ideologies and different aesthetics. But over the past decade, especially since 2013, 2014, they begin to work together. They don't have a secret room where they meet. There isn't, it's like, in the James Bond movies where there's the bad guys sit around the table. That's not like that. That
would be nice, easier to deal with.
No, that doesn't exist. But they have some things in common. They share a common kind of transactional attitude to power. All of them are, the leaders of all these countries are very rich. This makes them different also from the leaders of dictators of the 20th century. They are all billionaires. Xi is a billionaire, Putin is a billionaire. The Chavez family is very rich. I mean, Maduro family. Maduro is now is the president of Venezuela now. They're all very wealthy, and they have similar means of hiding their money. So they use this world of shell companies and tax havens to steal and hide money. They do that in a similar way, and they have similar interests in that sense. They've begun to use, not always precisely, but they've begun to use very similar kinds of propaganda. There's a sort of authoritarian propaganda, which is also, you can hear it also in Europe and America, which is all about the idea that autocracies are strong and kind of masculine and traditional and hierarchical and safe, and democracies are weak and divided and degenerate. And, you know, sometimes they even mean sexually degenerate, you know, and whereas autocracies are strong and safe. And you can hear a version of this coming from a lot of the dictators. And I trace in the book ways in which autocratic narratives get used and copied from one state to another. Actually, the example I used, do you remember at the beginning of the war, the full-scale invasion, there was this fake story about Ukrainian biolabs? Remember this? That there's biological weapons laboratories supposedly run by the Americans and hidden in Ukraine, and that this is the real reason for the invasion. This was a made-up story. It was fake. It was shown actually at the UN. There was an investigation that shows that it's fake, so it's not true. But I found this biolab narrative. I found it in many languages. I found it in Iran. I found it in Venezuela. I found it in all over Africa. I found it in all over Latin America. I found also there was an American Twitter account that promoted it very strongly that had millions of clicks and millions of views. So the use of these narratives, you know, they copy and learn from one another. And then finally, of course, what they really share is they share a common enemy. And the enemy is us. You know, the enemy is people like us. So the enemy, and of course, the enemy is people who use the language of democracy, the language of transparency, the language of accountability, and the language of rights, and the language of rule of law. Partly because this is the language of their own internal opposition. So, you know, the language of the Hong Kong democracy movement, or the Iranian women's rights movement, or indeed the Navalny movement in Russia, which was an anti-corruption movement. You know, they use, so their goal is to push back against that language and against states who use it. And of course, until January, the United States was a kind of leader of the world states who use that language, and the United States also had many institutions that promoted it, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Radio Svoboda, as well as USAID, as well as other, you know, and the Trump administration is now cutting exactly those precise institutions. That means that the countries who are best poised now to defend that language and to show why it's not, you know, why it builds strong societies rather than weak ones are, you know, Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, you know, and Ukraine. As you know, and with the Asian democracies and other democracies around the world, but they seek to show that this language is fake, that it's not real, that it creates weakness. I mean, there's a whole set of narratives designed to undermine it. I should say that one of the main arguments of the book is that, unlike in the Cold War, it's not as if the world is divided into two groups, and there's, you know, Democrats and communists, and there's a Berlin Wall in between them. Instead, what we have is a kind of war of ideas that takes place inside almost every country. And so you can find people using autocratic behavior or autocratic language in Germany and in Poland and in Russia, and you can also find people who believe in democracy and the rule of law also inside Russia and inside Germany and inside Poland. And so I didn't want to, and it's also the case that the so-called Western world or the democratic world has also been responsible for allowing the growth of autocracy, both through economic decisions over the last 30 years, as well as through not recognizing early enough signs that Russia and China especially were collaborating and had military goals here and in other places. But it's a very short book. You can read it. It is or will be published in Ukrainian. I'm not sure yet, but it's obviously in English, and in fact, it will also be published in Russian in the next few months. So,
I don't think we would have access to a Russian book here, but we hope to have a Ukrainian translation.
you want people, but you would like people in Russia to read it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But what are the reasons, in your opinion, for this rise of authoritarianism globally? Is that the new technology? Is that something else?
I mean, some of it is simply to do with a shift in the balance of economic power. You know, there was this period in the 90s when Russia was very weak, when the Chinese were still very neutral, their economy was still growing. And you've had the economic growth in Russia and China as well as other autocracies over the last 30 years that has simply made them more powerful and so on. Also, though, the nature of modern technology, especially information technology, social media, but also surveillance technology and AI, is working to the advantage of the autocratic world. And so I have a chapter in the book that's also about the Chinese spent a lot of the last 30 years building this incredible system of surveillance, which includes online surveillance, so they can monitor what people say and write, as well as street cameras and ways of measuring who's traveling where and who's using electricity, and they're able to use AI to put all this data together. And the Chinese now sell those systems to other people. They sell them, whether to Zimbabwe and to, and other places. So modern technology right now is working in their favor, and again, the way in which social media developed and the use of social media algorithms also works in their favor, because social media favors angry, divisive, and emotional language. And that is useful to them because it creates divisions and polarization. I'm sure I don't have to tell you. I don't have to describe that. I think we all know that now. So I think those are the primary reasons. I mean, there's a bigger economic argument. I mean, the growth of inequality in the United States and in Europe, this sense of some people becoming so wealthy that you can't even imagine how they live, and the difference between them and ordinary people is so great that it creates a feeling that democracy doesn't work and that it's somehow bought by rich people. I mean, I think that's a piece of the story. I mean, there are many elements of the story, but that's I think the technology, the shift in wealth, and the nature of the way in which the global economy reshaped national economies. I mean, I think those are the main reasons.
So how do you think this authoritarian tendency can be countered individually or institutionally?
First of all, it's very important to remember that most authoritarian states are very poor and unhappy. And authoritarianism generally leads to poverty. So best example of this is a country very near here, and that is Hungary. So Hungary was, in the 1990s, it was the kind of star of Central Europe. Everybody wanted to invest in Budapest. It was the nicest city. They had some privatization in the 80s, and it was open even before other countries were open. And then they also had a long period of foreign investment. They had a long period of EU money. Hungary is now, I only noticed this because I was looking at statistics about Europe. Hungary is now depending on which measure you use, it's either the very poorest country in the EU, or it's the second poorest, and sometimes the third poorest. But it has been declining on almost every measure, on measures of productivity, on measures of industrial output, on measures of governance, on measures of corruption. Because one of the things that Viktor Orban's kind of soft authoritarianism has created is this huge opportunities for corruption. And so as the state became more corrupt, as the business community a piece of the business community became a kind of client of the state. Again, something probably you've had here also, so you know what I'm talking about. That led to economic decline. And so very often there's a link between the more statist, the more corrupt, the more closed, the more untransparent, the less rule of law, the more poverty you get. So these are not necessarily recipes for success. Russia has maintained the economic position that it has solely and only because of its energy resources. I mean, it's not like we buy a lot of Russian cars or Russian iPhones,
Even books.
Sorry?
Even books.
They have some good writers, never mind. And China is an exception as well. I mean, China, you could argue, is a country that became wealthy because it adopted some of the practices of the more open world. That it allowed some competition and so on. But it's also still held back by authoritarianism and corruption. But really, most countries, I mean, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Iran, these are countries that have been very badly damaged by corruption. So that's one thing to remember. So this isn't a huge, like a formula for great success or prosperity. And we also have a very recent example of one of the autocracies, one of the ones that was supported by several others, collapsing overnight, and that's Syria. So Syria is a country that was kept stable for 50 years by support from Russia and Iran. As Russia and Iran became poorer, Russia spent all of its resources fighting Ukraine, Iran subsidizing its proxies all over the Middle East. The Syrian regime, literally from one day to the next, nobody wanted to fight for it anymore, and it collapsed. And this is a lesson for other dictatorships. They don't have, when you have a system that only is held together by fear, when you have a system that's getting poorer all the time, this is not a recipe for long-term stability. So the idea that this is, that the autocracies have some formula that will last forever, I think this is wrong.
Okay, and this is the point where we will get a little bit more theoretical. Because you are here also for the Lviv Media Forum, and yesterday there was a panel where you discussed one thing that I thought was very interesting. This is something that you called collapse of enlightenment thinking. This enlightenment project, which described reality in a certain way and structured politics in a certain way, is endangered. What exactly did you mean by that?
This was, funny enough, I was inspired to write this by the Romanian election, the one that was canceled with the candidate Georgescu, I'm sure you all followed. Because I went back and looked at, because the reason the election was canceled, if you'll remember, because he ran this social media campaign that somebody invested $1 million into, which he never declared. So I thought, okay, let's have a look at the social media campaign. And I have a young friend who downloaded and translated for me a lot of his media clips. And a lot of it was it wasn't just conspiracy theories. It was about how he is blessed by God and he is protected by the Lord, and therefore he can swim in a very cold lake in the winter with pictures of him swimming and there's snow falling all around. And he doesn't get sick because he's saved by his faith. And, there were many examples of him, almost, kind of looking mystical or proposing various strange health theories. And it was a kind of hypnotic, anti-rational campaign. It was about spirituality and health, and you can be saved and you can be healthy if only you believe in, in this kind of mystical set of ideas. And that was actually his appeal. And of course, he was also, as you know, he was also used the language of the old fascist movements and so on. But this was we've seen some of this same language more recently in the United States, a kind of directly anti-science, anti-rationality appeal. So don't think too hard about the facts. Don't ask a doctor. Don't ask a scientist. Just believe. just how, a kind of mystical obscurantism. And of course this has always been, we've had, this is part of human behavior forever.
There was New Age sometime.
New Age, there's a New Age, I'm sure there's a left-wing version of it, there's a right-wing version of it, there are many different versions of it. But the speed with which it now spreads online and the way in which this kind of obscurantism now captures some political movements and governments is something I think, in the democratic world, I think is something new. When you think about it, how is it that we decide in our societies what's true and what's not true? Actually, it's a system, right? I mean, scientific research, there's a scientific method, there's a way of measuring experiments, there are, papers that are published, the scientists challenge one another and argue with one another, and they arrive at a conclusion. I mean, the same is true of other kinds of truth. I mean, there were media organizations and journalist organizations and journalist ethics codes and across ways of checking and reconfirming different kinds of information, and people concluded came to an idea of what reality was, also based on the existence of these systems, or there were government bodies that did research that determined how much pollution there was in the air, and then there were reliable publications that repeated those numbers, and then because we had those numbers, then we could create an anti-pollution program. So the creation of facts was very important for determining what policy would be. So once those systems fall apart, or people don't believe in them, or they break down, and people instead believe in mystical solutions or magic, then it's very hard to know how you make policy. I mean, if you don't have a system for determining how much pollution is in the air, then how do you create a program designed to limit pollution? And how do you have a debate about it in a parliament or in a Congress? And the degree to which the ability to establish some facts or some shared reality, the degree to which that was essential for democracy, is something that I think we didn't really understand until recently. And so one of the things that, I mean, you can see it very clearly in the US, but also in other places, that the breakdown of trust in this kind of, a friend of mine calls it the constitution of knowledge, the ways in which we determine what's true and not true, is also connected to this breakdown of democracy. Because if you don't have a shared reality, if you can't agree what happened yesterday, then you can't really debate it or decide anything about it or have a policy towards it. And I think that's a huge problem for a lot of modern democracies, but especially now American democracy, where you have this profound polarization and these deep differences between people, and just this, as I said, an inability even to agree on what's true and what's not true.
And why do you think is this happening? Is this the new technology? Is this atomization of people and communities?
I mean, many more people have written about this besides me. This is clearly connected to technology and the way in which people get and process information. And it's not the first time in history that it's happened. I mean, you have a similar phenomenon that happens at the time of the invention of the printing press, where suddenly there's an explosion of information, and some of it is good and some of it is bad, and people don't really have a way of determining which is which. And actually one of the results is you begin to have religious wars in Europe. And the other moment is you can talk about the invention of the radio, which is another beginning of the 20th century. Another moment when the system of how we know things or don't know things, or how information is transmitted, changes radically, and that creates very radical political changes as well. So I think we're just living through one of those moments.
That's rather optimistic. It means that we are going to overcome it at some point. Here I'd like to mention another concept which I think is very intriguing, is the policy of resentment and revenge, which was mentioned yesterday as well. Am I correct to understand you from yesterday's talk that policy of, or politics of revenge is trying to pay back someone or something that was that hurt you in the past, and therefore you act politically in a certain way which might be harmful to you in the future. Is that?
So, I mean, Trump, when he was running his campaign, he said it. Again, he says everything that he does. He's not a man of deep mystery. He said at one point, "I am your revenge." Anybody who feels embittered about the system, or they don't like their job, or they've been treated unfairly, and there are many such people, could see in him a kind of someone who would take revenge, against, the universities who rejected you, or the government that you feel didn't support you, or and so the politics of revenge is very old also. I mean, it's again probably as old as humanity. The leader who offers himself as a kind of symbol, who will fix your problems, who will improve how you feel, who will take revenge against whatever, the elites or the foreigners or the institutions that you don't like. I mean, this is very common, and it turned out to be effective. And again, you see this also in many countries.
Okay, I'll ask you one more question about the US then. This is one of the mysteries that we in Ukraine cannot explain to ourselves. Why?
I may not know the answer.
Well, that's possible, but let's try. Why aren't American intellectuals or people affected are not really protesting? I'll explain what I mean by that. Yesterday, I was asked by an American journalist about the Orange Revolution. Orange Revolution. I remember at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, one of Ukraine's leading universities, and its president leading his students on Maidan, as a group of protest. That was very risky to him. But universities thought that they have to stand up to Yanukovych somehow. So this is what we expect to see from Harvard or Stanford or other places. Is this actually happening, but we just don't see it?
It is happening at Harvard. Harvard is standing up. I mean, so first of all, remember, the Trump administration has been in office for 3 months. So this is a very short period of time. So, and in 3 months, you don't have this reconfiguring of the political system and people creating a protest movement. People are still, so first of all, there's still, a lot of the Trump decisions are still going through the court system. There are an enormous number of lawsuits, I mean hundreds of lawsuits. And they're beginning to work through the legal system and reaching the Supreme Court. So right now, people are looking at legal responses. And in some cases, institutional responses. I mean, Harvard has said they will not obey by what the Trump administration said. You have a lot of universities I'm aware of are part of very big lawsuits against the administration and so on. So right now, there have been some protests, but we're not at the state. Protest is what you do when there isn't anything else to do. There's no other tool. And I don't think we've reached the moment yet where people feel there are no other tools. So there's a lot of legal responses. There are political responses. I mean, I don't think there are a lot of American politicians in the Democratic Party, and even 1 or 2 in the Republican Party, who talk all the time and are critical all the time of Trump, and who have big public meetings and who have big social media followings. I don't think you necessarily see them here, because unless you're following them, I don't know that they're reported on by Ukrainian media or by international media. But yes, of course, that people are openly critical and talking about him all the time. It's not like people are suddenly all scared. There's a lot of reporting. There's a lot of polemic, and there's a lot of people doing things. And if we get to the stage where people need to protest, then maybe they will. I mean, I wouldn't count that out. But I just don't think it's that the Orange Revolution didn't happen in the very, 2 months after the election. I mean, these things take longer to, and the 2014 revolution didn't happen 2 months after Yanukovych became president. It happened later on. I also think that right now we're in a period where a lot of the rules and norms of American politics are changing, and not everybody has figured out what's the right response. I mean, you can almost see now with several Democratic leaders, you can see them competing, like people are trying different tactics, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is having these big public meetings and talking about oligarchy. Senator Chris Murphy is speaking on television and social media all the time about Trump breaking the law. The governor of California is trying to reach out to people on the right. I mean, there's a spectrum of responses. You know, a lot of people are doing different things. And also, we don't have a parliamentary system, and so there is no leader of the opposition. And there won't be until the next presidential election. But what you're seeing is lots of people doing lots of different things, and eventually one of them will prove the most successful, I think.
This is something we do not quite understand in Ukraine, that the political system in the US works differently from ours. For example, this legal branch is very, very important, not as important as in Europe and in Ukraine.
It's really important in America. And also remember, you know, our Supreme Court, everyone in America knows, not everyone, but many people know the names of all the justices. And when you study American history, you study partly the history of Supreme Court decisions. So it's part of the culture and part of the Constitution in a way that I think it's not in other places. I experienced this in Poland. We had in 2015 and 2016, there was a kind of assault on the Constitutional Tribunal, on the highest courts in Poland, and an attempt to pack the courts, to replace the judges with political figures. And that was, part of the reason it was possible was because there wasn't this strong feeling about the court, or nobody knew who the names of the judges were. They weren't public figures. There wasn't a lot of strong feeling about them. In the US, there is. So the court system matters a lot, and people are watching very carefully to see how that plays out.
Exactly. So actually, the American way to protest, the first line of protest is to go to court. Unlike it is in Ukraine, the first thing you do, you go to Maidan. And there, I'll have another theoretical question. Professor Ash, yesterday, your professor, whom Mayor has mentioned, he gave his list of measures to counter authoritarianism, and one of the measures was to act individually, not to individual will matters, individual decisions matters. Do not collaborate when it's not necessary. And this is something that Timothy Snyder has also mentioned on many occasions, that individual choices and actions matters. What do you think about it?
Individual choices matter, but also I'm a great fan of coalitions. You know, that it's very important to act, you know, to create links between people and between groups and between organizations that maybe do different things. You know, or people who have come from different parts of the political spectrum, but who can agree on things. I mean, the real answer to authoritarianism is an anti-authoritarian coalition. I mean, that's actually what happened in Poland. We have, the current government is actually 3 political parties. One is a center-left party, one is a center-right party, and one is a kind of big liberal party. And they disagree about a lot of things, actually. I mean, they have pretty profound disagreements, but they agreed that it was important to form a government that would restore Polish democracy and restore the rule of law. And sometimes those kinds of coalitions are necessary. I mean, again, this is something Ukrainians know too.
Well, since the word coalition is a very important word in Ukraine now, we all know the term coalition of willing, so I can't escape this question. And you are one of the sharpest commentators of the security issues in Europe as well, and the war in Ukraine. Can you give us your perspective on what's going on now and what might be the development?
So to be clear, European governments get it. They understand that Russia is dangerous. I mean, certainly the 5 leading countries. So it's, you know, Britain, Germany, France, Poland, plus the Scandinavians and the Balts. I mean, if you take all those countries together, there is no doubt the current governments and current leaders of all of those countries are well aware that Russia is a danger both to you and to them. You know, and they understand that the US US role in European defense is going to be more limited. So nobody is living in some kind of imaginary world, and nobody has any illusions. That doesn't mean that they would be able to, that they want to reject America, or they want to break up NATO, or they want to, do anything that would, create a huge break. You won't hear them saying that or talking like that, but that doesn't mean they don't recognize reality. There have been, in all of those countries, in different ways, they each has different politics, there have been really big changes to the military. So in Germany, you've just had the Bundestag deciding to borrow, I've forgotten now the number, but I mean many billions of dollars. And this is, for Germans, this is just an incredible change. Germans don't borrow money, they're against it. They had to have a special act of parliament in order to do it, and they're doing that in order to make a huge military investment. You have, you had in Poland over the last decade, really, but especially over the last 3 or 4 years, you also have this enormous investment in military equipment, and it's now at over 4% of GDP and maybe even approaching 5%. And so you have a really big shift in budgets and in thinking. And you do have, behind the scenes, a lot of scenario planning for all kinds of emergencies, and all kinds of possibilities. It's not that useful to talk about them in public because it's just obviously not. But of course, when you have a meeting of, when you have meetings of European leaders in Kiev, as you did a few days ago, or actually you had the European foreign ministers were here in Lviv last week, in the last few days. At those meetings, this is what they talk about. So there is yes, people are preparing. They're not going to tell you, they're not going to make lists in public of what they're doing, but yes, there's a lot of thinking about what might happen in the near future.
So are you rather optimistic or rather pessimistic?
I'm pretty I don't know, I'm certainly optimistic about Europe in the long term. So I think sadly, actually, I think the economic turmoil in the US and the tariffs and so on, and also the turmoil inside universities and scientific institutions is going to be good for Europe. Europeans are waking up to the need to attract, to build their own technological alternatives to America, and not to be left behind. I think the development of European defense industries is also very good for European economies and European thinking and European kind of strategic awareness, and I think that's happening now too. The question always is, how long does it take? I think I was saying a few minutes ago, obviously everybody is now thinking about building an alternative to Starlink. For all the obvious reasons, but it takes a long time to get satellites into the air. This is not something, you can't do it from one day to the next or 1 month to the next. So some of these things will take time to develop, but in the sort of medium term, I feel pretty optimistic about Europe.
Okay, thank you. We've been talking about for almost an hour now, covered
maybe enough, yeah, of me?
Well, we'll take a few questions from the audience, if you do not mind. Okay, so we have many questions. Now this lady in the blue, excuse me? No, yes.
Hi. So thank you very much for visiting. I'm a local here. I'll just provide a very short context to my question. Now for me personally, you've been someone who I could lean on, especially in the last few months, because I've enjoyed listening to a lot of your interviews, and especially with The Atlantic, the work that you do. So thank you for your work and for visiting again. And as a local, I will have a question like this. You've obviously researched this part of the world quite well, and also obviously the US as well. We live in Ukraine in a fight mode, pretty much. It's an existential threat that we're fighting, which means sometimes we lack the mental capacity and the resources to devote to actually building the country, because if you're in the flight or fight mode, you can't do much more. Now, from all of the work that you've done, especially in this region, what should we be paying attention still? If we have that little bit of resource, mental capacity or economic resource, what should we devote our time and resource to, in order not to slip into Hungary or not to slip into other cases that you've described? Thank you.
That's very hard for me to answer from the outside. You know, I mean, I don't want to tell Ukrainians what to do. I mean, you're doing so many things so well. It's not really my role. I mean, you know, it almost feels kind of cliche to talk about corruption, but obviously making sure that the defense industry, that other, you know, becomes and remains really entrepreneurial, you know, fueled by people with energy and vision, and doesn't become captured by political interests, and that you know, that a line between political power and economic power remains. I mean, I know it's very blurry here in Ukraine, but the more you can separate it, the healthier that is for the economy. I mean, the more you have a, you know, industry and economy that works not because it's dependent on the state for contracts or favors, but that works by initiative and energy, the better. I mean, I would say that's really important. And then obviously, you know, I've been hearing so much over so many years about the court system, but building that, strengthening it, making the courts something that people respect, and making sure that people who are drawn to the judiciary go there because they want to be, adhere to the rule of law, and again, not to be attached to a political person or movement. I mean, those are, I would say that's the other thing.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions? No, excuse me. This lady in white shirt, please.
I want to ask why Trump closed USAID program. Isn't this a good program for spreading influence of USA and democracy in the world?
Yeah, can you repeat the question, please? Yeah.
Okay. Why did Trump close USAID program? Isn't this a good program for spreading USA influence in the world and generally for spreading democracy?
Thank you. That was
So this question was about USAID. So I had imagined that they would cut USAID because it was a very big bureaucracy, and many people felt that not all the money was used well. I did not expect them to destroy it and to cut it in this way that was so chaotic. You know, so, you know, people were told from one day to the next that their contract was over. People who had been promised money didn't receive it. I mean, it was very, very, it created an enormous amount of chaos. And I know that happened here in Ukraine, but it was even worse in other parts of the world. You know, I imagine this was because they were looking for things they could cut in the government. Foreign aid always seems like something extra. Why are we helping these other people? It was something that felt like an easy thing to cut. And I also think that the argument for foreign aid, you know, why we do it, why it's necessary, why it's good for the world, wasn't made strongly enough by politicians in recent years. I mean, so it kind of, there was a gap between the extent of what we were doing and what Americans understood about it. You know, my view is especially the way in which USAID was cut is a disaster. I mean, I think it will prove to be, not only will it be bad for American foreign policy, and it will give America less influence in many places, but I mean, in Africa, people are already dying. I mean, the cut in medical services, US ran this huge program to prevent AIDS in Africa, and the US was has these huge humanitarian, you know, food programs and projects, you know, for refugees, not just in Africa, but around the world. And this will be there. I've actually seen already the beginning of this catastrophe, and I think it will get worse. And it will stick to this administration. It will be remembered that this is what they did. And so, as I said, I think it was very, very short-sighted. It was their idea that this will save money on something that Americans don't care about. But the implications and ramifications will go on for a long time.
Thank you. Just a few more questions. Please. Yes, this man there.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I run a local media, Your City Media-hab, based in Lviv. We are, by the way, broadcasting this event live. And I have two very short questions, if I may. One is, if I make conclusions right from this conversation, autocracies are not the main threat to democracy, but probably more the populism that leads to these authoritarianism and autocracies. We see what's going on in Poland today was mentioned. We see AfD in Germany, and you mentioned the case of Romania. Isn't it a time for us, the democratic world, democratic society, to invent something new that would help spreading the right narratives to save democracy? Because we see how strongly, and you mentioned how strongly social media and new technologies help those populist movements. And second is about communicating Ukraine to the world, as we are one of the key pillars today in saving Europe and democracy. But what we are lacking in telling about Ukraine to the world today. Thank you.
So first of all, I mean, the thing that people call populism when they use this word, it very often means authoritarianism. I mean, what we're talking about is people using authoritarian narratives who seek to create, one-man, strong-man political systems, who seek to push back against institutions. So I think this is the same thing. And yes, you're right. This is the internal threat to all democracies, actually, including this one. The nature of modern social media encourages it, because it encourages this simplistic thinking and this an emotional use of emotional language rather than rational argument. And yeah, I mean, we need a counter project, and there are many people around trying to think about it. And this is what's happening in the United States, is an argument about what the counter project should look like, what kind of language should it use, how should it work. But I'm sure that any Ukrainian contribution to the argument would be welcome. I mean, the Ukrainians have pulled together and created civic movements before, and maybe there are examples from Ukraine that we can use in other places. Wait, sorry. The second question was. Oh, communicating about Ukraine. So. I mean, actually, Ukraine does a pretty good job of communicating about Ukraine. There are, you've created these various channels that, Euromaidan or United 24 and so on, that people use and rely on. You have a president who's really good at showing up in Istanbul, to make a point when the point needs to be made. He was particularly in the first part of the full-scale invasion. He was. I mean, I've never seen a politician do what he did. I mean, he was on TV all the time, and he made his case all the time. And the problem you have now is not really one that is easy to fix, which is that you are now in competition with other stories and other things, whether it's the Gaza war in Gaza, whether it's the drama of the Trump presidency, and so there isn't the attention on Ukraine that there was, in 2022 and maybe even in 2023, and I'm not sure there's a clear solution to that. I mean, really though, this, and I've said this to Poles as well. I mean, Ukraine will really make a difference and will really be listened to and heard in a different way when you have things that people want. So when the Ukrainian drone industry begins to produce drones that the Estonians and the Germans are buying, and weapon systems that other people want, or when you have, I'm just making this up, okay? When you have dress designers or fabric designers who are suddenly fashionable in wherever, America or France, or when you have, when you think about how countries develop brands and identities and understanding, it's something that it can take it's a combination of things. It's not just narratives. It's not just kind of stuff that's said in social media or reporting. It's also actions and things. I mean, I have to say already in the last 3 years, the knowledge and understanding of Ukraine is maybe 300 times greater than it was 3 years ago. And Ukraine, by defending itself, by fighting back in this war, by having a president who does social media every night, has already created an image and a brand that's new, that didn't exist before. And again, it's through doing other things, through creating new industries, through, maybe through through inventing new ways of rehabilitating war victims, like you're doing here in Lviv. Through those kinds of projects that other people want to learn from, and this is how you build an image of a country. And I think it's happening.
So it's not always communication, it's also action.
It's not just strategic communication, right? It's also things, actions, people, your Nobel Prize winner, some of your writers, some of your artists. I mean, those are the things that that create and change and make people listen to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has a problem, which is this, barrage of Russian propaganda that is not just, again, and that's also not just communications. That's also, the Russians pay American influencers. We know this story, and they build connections, in all across Africa and Latin America, and they build sort of. So you have you have an unusual kind of competition. I mean, Spain also had to recreate its brand after Franco, but they didn't have Russia seeking to undermine it, so it was probably easier. But it's really through those actions and through creating these centers of excellence and through doing outstanding things that I think you communicate what Ukraine is the best. And it really is happening. I mean, I remember seeing a friend of mine who teaches at Harvard and who is affiliated, I won't say who, he was affiliated with the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard. And he said to me, we were used, all these years, we were like this little tiny group on the side of Harvard and nobody was that interested in us and we had our little programs and so on. And suddenly, everybody wants us to run big events and we have all these students who want to learn Ukrainian and, we're kind of overwhelmed. I mean, and I think it's, the Ukraine's, bravery and the Ukrainian fight for survival and your many people who are working to win this war. I mean, you are creating attraction and interest in Ukraine of a kind that just, that didn't exist before 2022.
Great. Thank you. 2 last questions. Bożena Polańska, please, and then the lady in the black.
Thank you very much for the talk. As someone who works with art and culture, I've got a question which bothers me a lot. Lately, we've seen in various international platforms, more and more Russian groups are given a voice. To us, it means, to us, people who work with art and culture, we believe that West world, let's call it like that, should abstain from that. But what's your view on that? Wouldn't that be fair to abstain as long as this war is, to abstain as art and culture is very instrumental in this case? So.
It's really
abstain, what I mean, not giving a voice to Russian art and culture representatives. Like very often, Ukrainian art and culture representatives are fighting or cannot leave the country, and a lot of cases where Russian movies are participating in international.
Bożena, I'm sorry. We understand we just can't hear clearly.
Okay.
So we don't need more context. So the question was whether Western institutions should abstain from showcasing Russian culture. Is that?
Yes, that's a question, wouldn't that be fair? And could you explain, is that fair?
Thank you.
I mean, you have to go case by case. I mean, yes, of course, I think that contemporary Russian culture, especially when it celebrates Putin's power, should be off limits. I'm not in charge of cultural institutions everywhere and in all countries, so I'm not in a position to make that call. I mean, there is I don't know, Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky. I mean, it's going to be hard to eliminate those things from the curriculum or from the from the world. But yeah, of course, I think that contemporary Russian culture shouldn't be awarded and shouldn't be endorsed, especially when it's when it's openly produced by people who are openly pro this totalitarian regime.
Thank you. And the last question, please.
First of all, thank you for your speech. And my question is, I would like to ask you about the immigration politics in the US now. I've seen some concerning videos on social medias of teachers saying that kids are being taken from schools by the government, as I understand, immigrants, children of immigrants. Is it really that? I know that on social media, on the internet, can be a lot of disinformation or misinformation. So can you explain how is it really going right now?
It's about immigration. Immigration.
Should I repeat it?
So there's an echo in the room, and it's very hard for us to hear you. So there's nothing wrong with your questions. We just don't hear them. I mean, look, yeah. The Trump administration appears to have empowered the immigration authorities to go into spaces where there are children, including schools, and threaten them and take them with their parents away. Yeah, I mean, it's I'm not aware off the top of my head, it's true that I don't follow it every day, of an instance where some small child has been taken away from a classroom, but certainly there are children being separated from their parents. There is enormous pressure put on families. And there are now, again, several court cases about people being illegally or unfairly deported. So it looks to me like the Trump administration wants to use this immigration as a kind of, it's a kind of performance of authoritarianism. It's a way of scaring people. It's a way of demonstrating power and authority. And they want to use it to intimidate people in all kinds of ways. I think that's the real purpose of it. I mean, actually, in terms of sheer numbers, I would have to check, but actually the Obama administration and the Biden administration both deported people all the time. So it's not like this is a new practice. What's new is the dramatization of it, the social media versions of it. The ugly threats to schools and churches. This is a new element. It's a kind of performance of cruelty that is that's very ugly and very new.
Thank you, Anne. Енн Епплбом, I have been privileged to talk to you. It was very interesting for all of us. Thank you for coming to Lviv, and thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.